In a little town of Oakhaven, where the main street had only one stoplight and everyone knew each other's names, there was one person nobody knew at all. High up on the hill at the edge of town stood a large, old house. Its paint was cracked and peeling like sunburnt skin, and the wraparound porch sagged in the middle as if it were tired. A rusty iron gate, always closed, squealed a warning whenever the wind blew. This was the home of the widow in black, the town's greatest mystery and its deepest fear. For 10 long years, she had lived there alone. The children of Oakhaven dared each other to run up the hill and touch her gate, but they always sprinted back down, breathless and terrified, convinced they had heard a ghostly whisper or seen a shadow move behind a dusty window. They said she was a witch who had cursed her own husband. They said she could turn you to stone with a single look if you were ever foolish enough to see her eyes. The adults were not much better. They did not tell silly stories, but they did tell wary ones. Mothers would pull their children closer when the subject of the widow came up. Fathers would warn their families to stay away from that part of town, especially after dark. They spoke in low tones about a tragedy long ago, about a young husband who died too soon, and a wife whose grief had turned her heart cold and strange. They called it a lasting sadness, a cloud of bad luck that hung over the property. To them, the widow in black was not a person, but a cautionary tale, a ghost story made real. She was a silhouette behind a curtain, a figure in a dark dress seen briefly in her overgrown garden, and a reason to lock your doors a little tighter at night. She was the shadow on the hill, and everyone in Oakhaven was afraid of the dark. If the widow's house on the hill was a place of shadows and mystery, then Elias McCade's ranch in the sunlit valley below was a place of quiet, steady routine. The camera would open on a wide, peaceful shot of rolling green fields, split by a neat wooden fence. The sound of the breeze moving through the tall grass is gentle and constant. This is a place of work and of solitude. The view would then find our second main character, Elias. He is a man in his late 50s, with a kind, weathered face that looks like it has been shaped by sun and wind. His hands are rough from years of hard work. He is not unfriendly, but the quietness around him is deep. He moves through his day with a practiced ease, feeding his horses, mending his tools, checking on his small herd of cattle. He speaks more to his animals than he does to people, his voice a low, gentle rumble. The narrator would explain that Elias has lived this way for 12 years. 12 years ago, his wife, Clara, grew very ill and passed away. The ranch, once filled with her laughter and music, became a very quiet place. Elias's own grief was a heavy weight, but he did not let it turn him bitter. Instead, it made him thoughtful. He learned to bake his own bread, to sew a loose button, and to sit with his own silence. He understands loss intimately. From his front porch, Elias can often see the dark shape of the widow's house on the hill. The townsfolk's fearful whispers about curses and witches have reached his ears, but he has always dismissed them. He knows that fear often grows in the empty spaces where understanding should be. When he looks up at that lonely house, he does not see a monster. He feels a pang of recognition. He sees a solitude that mirrors his own, and he wonders about the person living inside it, the real person behind the town's frightening stories. His curiosity is not born from bravery, but from a shared sense of being alone in the world. The peace of the valley was shattered one afternoon by a sudden and violent summer storm. The video would show dark, boiling clouds rushing in to blot out the sun. The wind would howl, bending the trees and whipping rain in horizontal sheets. Inside his sturdy ranch house, Elias would watch from his window, a cup of coffee in his hand, his face calm but concerned. High on the hill, a single light would flicker in the window of the widow's house, a lonely beacon in the gloom. The next morning would dawn bright and clear, the world washed clean and sparkling. Elias would saddle his horse early to ride the fence line and assess any damage from the storm's fury. The soundtrack would be the squelch of the horse's hooves in the wet earth, the cheerful calls of birds, and the drip of water from the leaves. His journey would take him to the far western edge of his land, where his property meets the wild, overgrown edge of the widow's estate. And there, he would find the problem. A massive old pine tree, weakened by the wind, had toppled over completely, smashing a long section of the wooden boundary fence into splinters. This was a serious issue. His cattle could easily wander through this gap and get lost or hurt. Elias would simply get to work. He would unload his tools from his saddlebag, his movements efficient and practiced. The sounds of his labor, the thud of a new post being set, the unspooling of barbed wire, would be the only noise for a long time. Then a subtle change would occur. The camera would focus on Elias as he pauses, sensing he is being watched. He would slowly turn his head. There at the tree line where her land begins stands the widow in black. She is perfectly still, her dark dress stark against the bright green of the wet leaves, her veil hiding her face as always. She does not move or speak. She is simply observing. Most people in Oakhaven would have frozen. They would have remembered every scary story, dropped their tools, and hurried away. But Elias McCade is not most people. He looks at the figure for a long, quiet moment. He sees not a monster, but a person standing in the shadows of the trees. He makes a decision. He calmly tips the brim of his worn hat in a gesture of polite respect. "Morning, ma'am," he would say, his voice a calm and steady sound in the quiet morning. "Quite a storm we had." There is a long, heavy silence. The only movement is the breeze stirring the edges of her black veil. Elias does not fidget or look away. He simply waits, giving her all the time she needs. Finally, a voice answers. It is softer than he imagined, laced with surprise, and slightly rusty from lack of use. "Yes," the voice from behind the veil says. "It was." Then, she turns and melts back into the woods, leaving Elias alone with the broken fence, the morning sun, and the first words ever spoken between them. The memory of that soft-spoken reply lingered with Elias throughout his day. It was not a voice that matched the town's frightening stories. It was a voice that sounded, to him, simply lonely. He thought of his own first years alone on the ranch, how the silence could feel so heavy. He thought about the simple comfort of a shared meal, something he had missed dearly. An idea began to form in his mind, a small thing, but one that felt right. The following afternoon, the warm, yeasty smell of fresh-baked bread filled his kitchen. He had baked 2 loaves. Once they had cooled, he wrapped one in a clean cloth, placed it in a basket, and set out toward the hill. He did not ride all the way to her porch. Instead, he stopped at the now-repaired gate, a place that felt like a respectful boundary. He opened the gate just enough to place the basket inside on the ground. He did not wait or call out. He simply turned his horse and went back down the hill the way he had come. From an upstairs window, Eleanor Vance watched him leave. She had seen him approach, her heart beating a nervous rhythm against her ribs. When he was gone, she crept downstairs and out to the gate. She retrieved the basket, her fingers trembling slightly as she untied the cloth. The warmth of the bread seeped into her hands. She stood there for a long time, holding it, a simple kindness she had not experienced in a decade. A few days later, a new sound plagued the quiet hill, a persistent, metallic shrieking that grated on the nerves. The pump for her well had finally given out, its rusty innards refusing to draw water. Elias, working in his nearby field, heard the awful sound. He recognized it immediately for what it was. Without a second thought, he gathered his toolbox and walked up the hill. He found her standing helplessly by the shrieking pump. He did not ask permission. He simply gave her a brief, reassuring nod, set down his toolbox, and got to work. For the next hour, the only sounds were the clink of his tools and the fading cries of the pump as he fixed it. When he finished, a clear, cold stream of water flowed once more. He packed his tools and tipped his hat to her, still standing silently on the porch. "All set," he said, his voice kind. He was almost at the bottom of the hill when he heard it. 2 words, carried softly on the breeze from the porch behind him. "Thank you." He paused, smiled to himself, and continued home without turning around. A bridge was being built, not from grand gestures, but from bread and repaired pumps, from silence that was no longer empty, but filled with a growing understanding. The following days saw a subtle shift on the hill. The video would open not on Elias's ranch, but on Eleanor's porch. The morning sun would be warm, highlighting the dust motes dancing in the air. Eleanor would be outside, not just watching from a window. She would be carefully sweeping the long, neglected porch, her black skirts swishing softly with each movement. The simple act of Elias's kindness had stirred something in her, a faint desire to push back against the decay that had gripped her home and her life. The camera would then find Elias. He is purposeful as he walks through a sun-drenched meadow on his land, his eyes scanning the colorful patches of wildflowers that grew near the tree line. He moves slowly, selecting a few blooms with care, a small bunch of blue, yellow, and purple. His rough, calloused hands are surprisingly gentle as he picks them. He does not overthink the action. It feels as natural as mending a fence. He carries them up the hill, the colors a bright spot against the earthy tones of his clothes. He approaches her gate, which now stands open, a silent and significant invitation. Eleanor stops her sweeping, her hand tightening on the broom handle. She watches him, a mixture of anxiety and anticipation in her posture. Elias stops a respectful distance away, holding out the small, informal bouquet. "Thought these might brighten up the place," he would say, his voice a low, warm rumble that fits perfectly with the peaceful morning. "They reminded me of you." The sentence hangs in the air between them, simple and profound. Eleanor is utterly still. The camera would focus on her hands, clenched tight, then slowly relaxing. It would focus on Elias's face, patient and earnest, holding the flowers steady. The only sound is the buzz of bees and the distant call of a bird. Then a decision is made. Eleanor's hands rise, not to take the flowers, but to her face. The music, if there were any, would swell very softly here. Her fingers, trembling only slightly, find the edge of the black veil that has been her shield for a decade. There is a moment of hesitation, a final battle with an old, deep fear. Then, with a slow, deliberate motion, she lifts the veil. She folds it back over the dark crown of her hair, revealing her face to the sunlight and to Elias McCade for the first time. The camera would show us what Elias sees. She is not a young woman, but neither is she the crone from the children's stories. Her face is pale from years spent indoors, and fine lines of grief and time are etched around her eyes and mouth. But her eyes are a deep, warm brown, and they hold a vulnerability that is breathtaking. She looks tired and sad, but also kind. It is the face of a person, a real and whole person, who has endured a great pain and survived it. Elias does not startle. He does not gasp or look away. His expression does not change to pity or shock. Instead, it softens. A warm, genuine smile spreads across his weathered face, crinkling the corners of his eyes. He looks at her, truly looks at her, and he sees her. He takes a small step forward, his gaze holding hers, and he speaks the words that break the final chain of the old story. "Well," he says, his voice full of a quiet wonder that makes the words completely true. "Ain't you just beautiful?" For a long moment, Eleanor simply absorbs this. No one has called her anything but the widow in 10 years. The word beautiful is a foreign language, a forgotten song. And then something miraculous happens. A tear escapes from the corner of her eye, tracing a path down her cheek, but is not a tear of sadness. And then, slowly, tremulously, her lips curve upward. It is a small smile, hesitant and unused, but is real. It transforms her entire face, lighting it from within. It is the first smile she has given anyone in a decade, and it is offered to the one person who thought to bring her flowers. The silence that followed Elias's words was not the old, heavy silence of fear or loneliness. It was a new kind of quiet, one filled with a fragile and growing understanding. Eleanor did not pull the veil back down. She let the sun fall fully on her face as she finally reached out and accepted the small bunch of wildflowers. Her fingers brushed against his for the briefest moment, a connection that felt electric after so many years of isolation. "Would you?" she began, her voice still soft but clearer now, less rusty from disuse. "Would you like to come in for some tea? I am afraid I cannot offer much else." The invitation was a monumental act of courage. Elias nodded, his smile gentle. I would be honored. He followed her into the house. The interior was dim, but not dirty. It was a place frozen in time, filled with furniture draped in old sheets like sleeping ghosts. Dust danced in the slivers of light cutting through the gaps in the curtains. But in the parlor, one chair by the fireplace was clear of dust and had a small reading lamp beside it, an island of life in a sea of stillness. She led him to the kitchen, which was simple but clean, and prepared the tea with hands that gradually stopped shaking. They sat at the small kitchen table, the steam from their cups rising between them. For a while, they simply sat in the new, comfortable quiet. Then, Eleanor began to speak. She told him her name was Eleanor Vance. She spoke of her husband, Thomas, not as a ghost from a scary story, but as a real man with a loud laugh who loved to build bookshelves that were slightly crooked. She described how they had moved to this house full of dreams and paint samples, how they had planned to fill the rooms with children and laughter. Her voice grew quieter as she spoke of the illness, a slow and cruel sickness that stole Thomas away piece by piece. She described the long, lonely nights of caring for him, the helplessness, and the profound silence that followed his passing. The black clothes were not a curse, she explained. They were the uniform of her grief, a deep and endless mourning for a love that had been cut short. The veil was not to hide a monstrous face, but to hide her tears from a world that did not know how to look at such raw sadness. She hid away because the world outside was too bright, too loud, and too full of couples holding hands. The town's fear, she said, was a wall that built itself around her, and she had been too tired and too broken to try and climb it. She was not a witch. She was just a woman who had forgotten how to be around people because her heart had been shattered. Elias listened. He did not interrupt. He simply nodded, his own eyes glistening with shared understanding. When she finished, he told her about his Clara, about the emptiness on the ranch after she was gone, and about the years of silence he had endured. They were not so different, the widow on the hill and the rancher in the valley. They had both been living in separate prisons of grief, believing they were alone in their sentences. Now they had found a visitor in the next cell, someone who understood the architecture of loss without needing a map. They had found a friend. Change, when it comes after so long, does not arrive with a loud noise or a grand event. It comes quietly, like the first green shoots breaking through the thawing earth in spring. The transformation began with a simple blue dress. One morning, Eleanor Vance looked at her black dresses hanging in the closet, and then at the blue sky outside her window. She reached for a dress of a soft cornflower blue, one she had not worn in over a decade. The fabric felt different against her skin, lighter. She began to venture outside more, not just on her porch, but into her garden. She started pulling the tenacious weeds that had claimed her flower beds. Elias often came to help, bringing new seeds and plants from town. Together, they turned the wild, tangled mess into a place of order and beauty. Color returned to the hill, first in small patches, then in great blooming bursts of yellows, pinks, and purples. The people of Oakhaven noticed. They saw the widow in black, who was a widow no longer in color, working in her garden. They saw Elias McCade beside her, talking and sometimes laughing. The stories of curses and witches began to sound foolish even to those who had once told them. The children were the first to approach, drawn by the bright flowers. Eleanor would sometimes offer them a freshly baked cookie, and their wide, smiling eyes replaced the fearful glances of the past. Then, one Saturday, Eleanor walked with Elias into the town itself. She held her head high, her hands clasped gently in front of her blue dress. People stopped to watch, but this time their stares were not of fear, but of curiosity and dawning understanding. They saw a kind-faced, somewhat shy woman, not a specter. Mrs. Gable, the shopkeeper, was the first to speak directly to her, asking about her flowers. The conversation was awkward, but it was a start. The house on the hill was no longer a place of darkness. In the evenings, a warm, golden light shone from its windows. Often, the silhouette of Elias could be seen on the porch swing next to Eleanor. They were two friends who had found each other after a long and lonely journey. They had not erased their pasts or their sadness, but they had built a new present around it, a present filled with simple companionship and quiet understanding. The entire town of Oakhaven learned a valuable lesson that season. They learned that a kind word, a simple hello, and the courage to look past a scary story can change everything. Fear had built a wall around that hill, but kindness had patiently taken it down, one stone at a time. And in the end, light and friendship had won. The end.